Yeah, I also want to ask you, because you talked about the immigrant experience and about, Italians being the first ones or last ones hired and the first ones fired. I want to ask you about, because it's a perception that Italians have issues with black people, or the mafia is very racist. And I just want to talk about your Uncle Al's unique connection to the black community. And, a lot of people don't know. There's some things that you raised in the book that I thought was very interesting. I didn't even know about Al Capone in terms of his relationship with black people. And can you just touch on that a little bit?
Sure. I think because they were so discriminated against. I mean, they were called WAPs. When they were in school, the teachers, who were all Irish, called them smelly, called them stinky, called them dumb, lazy. I mean, kind of the way that the black people were described, in the 40s and 50s. But I think that was the reason that they had a very soft spot in their heart to people who were having a tough time. My grandfather opened up a club in Cicero. It's called the Cotton Club, and it was patterned after the Cotton Club in Harlem. Oni, what was his last name? Oni Madden. Oni Madden,
yeah.
That owned the Cotton Club in Harlem was a very close personal friend of my grandfather's. They traveled together, and I met Oni many, many times in Hot Springs after he went to Hot Springs, Arkansas. But the difference between the two cotton clubs, of course, the one in Harlem was in the black community. The one that was in Cicero was not. So my grandfather would have to send an armed guard to go into the black community to get these entertainers, drive them to the Cotton Club, and make sure that they were protected there. Nat Cole was discovered by my grandfather, as was Ethel Waters, a lot of entertainers. My grandfather took me to a club on Rush Street many years ago called the Chez Paris, and we were there, and of course we were being entertained by Nat King Cole. And after he finished, the waiter came and said my grandfather and I were invited backstage to meet Nat King Cole. So we went backstage, and Nat himself looked at me and said, I want you to know I would not have the career that I have today if it wasn't for your grandfather.
That's incredible. And also, it's a couple of stories I want to share with you, too, as well. And I know I talked to blues great Bobby Rush, not the politician from Chicago, but the blues musician. And he talked about how he was in New Orleans, and his big break came at a club. I forgot the name of it when I interviewed him, but he talked about how his cousin was a mistress of one of Al Capone's cousins. And that's how he got his big break in the music business.
Absolutely.
And also the Cotton Club, it's interesting because Cicero is the same place where Dr. King got a brick thrown at his head in the 60s, so you wasn't lying about that protection. But also, are you familiar with Walter Barnes, who was the band director at this Cotton Club, his story?
Remind me.
Walter Barnes? Walter Barnes, he was the... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm listening.
The reason why I bring up Walter Barnes, where you brought the Cotton Club, because he was the band director for the most part at the Cotton Club in Cicero. I think he was Al Capone's favorite. He helped him get on the airwaves in Chicago. Like Al Capone actually helped integrate the Chicago airwaves by getting him on the airwaves in Chicago to broadcast them and whatnot. And when Al Capone went to jail, they were like one of his biggest sponsors or boosters. He had to start hitting the road. He became one of the founding fathers of what is now known today as the Chitlin Circuit. He was a columnist for the Chicago Defender. But the reason I bring him up also is because he met his end April 23rd, 1940 in Natchez, Mississippi, what is now known as the Rhythm Club Fire. It's like one of the worst building fires in American history. Over 200 people got killed that night. And he was on stage performing a song. In order to calm the crowd down, he played this song called Bleed Marie. And the stage, the roof fell on the stage. But he had a big funeral in Chicago back in 1940. Over thousands of people came out. But he was he benefited greatly from your Uncle Al's patronage. But he's the guy that I know benefited from him. So I didn't know if you was familiar with that story of Walter Barnes or not.
Yeah. Also, I know I tell it in my book, but my grandfather told me that they planned to buy the Chicago Cubs, and
Oh, wow.
my family are baseball people. I mean, we loved baseball, but they wanted to buy the Chicago Cubs, and my grandfather said that Al wanted to bring Satchel Paige up from the Negro League and have him be the first black player in the National Leagues. And they were going to make Babe Ruth the player manager. But, of course, you know, the Yankees wouldn't let Babe Ruth go. But Babe Ruth knew Al Capone. I mean, I could go on and on. My family also befriended a lot of black prize fighters, a lot of them, and gave them money to, you know, build them up and bolster them. And so, yeah, then these people could start doing things with their families so that they can open up businesses. And before that, you know, you just couldn't. And that was the whole way that that whole society back then did that. But there were certain factions of our society that were, you know, kind of held back. After the Italians, it was the blacks, and a lot of the Italian mobsters sympathized with that, and they did take their money. My black man came up to me. I was doing a book signing somewhere. I think it was in Chicago. And he came up to me, and when he found out who I was, he says, "I want to thank you." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "Your grandfather gave my grandfather money, and he built a still in the black section of Chicago to provide alcohol for the black people because they couldn't get it any other way."
Let me ask you this. I had a question to ask you, too, about a relationship between your family and the black community in Chicago. My understanding is that Al Capone had an understanding with the black numbers policymakers or policy kings in Chicago that he would not, you know, encroach upon their territory when it came to the numbers of policy, that it was a black people racket. Is that true? Did he have like some type of agreement?
There was a black mafia, and for your information, the Italian mafia, what you see as mafia, you must be Sicilian descent to be part of the mafia. So the Capones were never part of the mafia. But there also, during Prohibition, was a black mafia, and that is being portrayed on Boardwalk Empire. So they were into drugs. My family was never into drugs. My grandfather would have nothing to do with anything that would control somebody. You know, alcohol doesn't control people. I mean, if you want to go and not drink for 3 or 4 weeks, you know, you can get dried out. I mean, there are people that are alcoholics, but it doesn't, you know, control you. But there was a black syndicate. I guess they called it a syndicate back then, not the mafia. A black syndicate during the same time, and they worked together. You know, the bootleggers and the black syndicate worked together.
And I also want to ask you too. I mean, I think it's interesting because, like you said, your family or your uncle and your grandfather seem to have a great relationship with black people in Chicago in the black community. But then you get somebody like Sam Giancana, Momo. I know I read his book Double Cross. There was another numbers king, a policy king named Ted Rowe. Are you familiar with Teddy Rowe at all? With that name, Teddy Rowe?
I know that name. I know Giancana very well, and I choose not to talk about him. My grandfather told me quite a bit about Giancana. But see, Giancana's Sicilian. Giancana is mafia.
Okay. Now, he didn't like black people. I know from what I read, you know, so he might have liked them as entertainers, but he didn't think of them as being equals with white people.
Well,
but I know. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Turn of the century when people started immigrating to this country. In Italy during the 18th century, the Italians were Italians, but the Sicilians were Sicilians. The Italians in the boot of Italy treated the Sicilians the way the Caucasians in America would treat the blacks during, the early 19th century. So the Sicilians didn't have empathy. They had anger. Because they were treated the same way you were being treated. So I'm sure there was no kindness there at all. But the Italians were completely different. Accardo was Italian. Giancana was Sicilian.
I'm glad you made a distinction because popular culture does not make that distinction clearly. And I know I talk to some of these gangsterologists and people like that. They do make the distinction. And I'm glad you, as a person who knows who they're talking about,